The perfect pastor. For years, Pastor Elijah Moore was the pride of the small town of Ravens Creek, Georgia. He was everything the townspeople admired: charismatic, kind, and devoted to his faith. Every Sunday, the old wooden church on Pine Hill Road overflowed with people eager to hear his powerful sermons about family, forgiveness, and divine purpose. To outsiders, Elijah's life was perfect. He had a beautiful wife, Miriam, and 2 young children, Samuel and Grace, who were often seen sitting in the front pew, smiling proudly at their father. The Moores were the image of holiness, always together, always radiant. But behind the polished sermons and angelic smiles, something was deeply wrong. Whispers began to spread quietly through the congregation months before tragedy struck. The choir director once mentioned that Pastor Elijah had become different, more intense, withdrawn, obsessed with secret revelations he claimed God was showing him. He stopped allowing anyone to enter the church basement, where he said he was building something special for the Lord. At first, everyone thought it was another community project, maybe a food pantry or prayer room. But the workers he hired were suddenly dismissed halfway through construction. No one knew why. Miriam was the first to voice her fear. One night, she confided in a neighbor that Elijah had started waking up at 3 a.m., chanting scriptures and writing strange symbols in his study. "He says God speaks to him now," she whispered. "But it doesn't sound like God anymore." A week later, Miriam stopped showing up to Sunday service. Elijah told everyone she was visiting her sick mother in another state. The children, too, were said to be resting at home. But something about his calm, practiced smile made people uneasy. 3 days later, a strong, sour odor began to seep from the cracks of the church's wooden floorboards, just above the locked basement door. And that was when everything began to unravel. By the 3rd day, the smell had become unbearable. It wasn't just the faint staleness people first noticed. It was thick, sour, and heavy, spreading through the sanctuary every time someone opened the front doors. Some of the elderly church members whispered that maybe a raccoon or stray dog had crawled under the floorboards and died. But others, especially the ones who had known Miriam, felt an unspoken dread. On that Sunday morning, Pastor Elijah stood behind the pulpit as usual. But something about him was off. His face looked pale, his eyes glassy. He preached about sacrifice that day, about Abraham being willing to give up his son for the will of God. His voice trembled with emotion, and when he slammed his hand on the Bible, people in the front row flinched. After service, a deacon named Harold Benson approached him carefully. "Pastor, sir, the smell, it's getting worse. Maybe something's died down there. Should we take a look?" Elijah's smile froze. "There's nothing down there, Brother Harold. It's holy ground. The Lord's work is not to be disturbed." The words sent a strange chill through the old man. Later that evening, while Elijah was gone on what he called a prayer retreat, Harold and 2 other deacons returned with a flashlight and crowbar. They pried open the door leading to the basement, something Elijah had forbidden for months. What they saw first was a set of stairs descending into damp darkness. The smell hit them so hard that one man vomited. When they shined their light deeper, they noticed the dirt had been freshly dug, and that there were 3 wooden crosses crudely nailed to the wall, smeared with some kind of dark, sticky substance. Near the back of the basement, they found 3 small mounds of disturbed earth. Each was covered by a thin white sheet. That's when Harold dropped his flashlight. He didn't need to lift the sheets to know what was underneath. The men ran out of the church, pale and shaking, and called the sheriff. Within an hour, police cars surrounded the property, red and blue lights flashing across the stained glass windows of what had once been the town's most beloved church. But when they went to arrest Pastor Elijah Moore, he was nowhere to be found. His car was still in the church parking lot. His phone and Bible lay open in his office. And on the pulpit, written in red ink that looked far too much like blood, were the words, "They are not dead, they have ascended." The town of Ravens Creek had never seen so many flashing lights in one place. Police, county deputies, and forensic teams crowded around the little wooden church on Pine Hill Road, their boots crunching against gravel and broken glass. The building that once echoed with hymns now felt cursed, its steeple casting a long shadow over the crowd of horrified onlookers. Inside the church basement, investigators worked in grim silence. The 3 shallow graves told a story no one wanted to believe. The bodies of Miriam, Samuel, and Grace Moore were found, wrapped in white sheets, their faces serene but pale. There were no signs of external injuries, no blood, no struggle. Just earth packed tightly over them, as if they'd been laid to rest alive. The medical examiner's preliminary report suggested that the victims had suffocated. Dirt was found in their lungs. When Sheriff Dale Henson heard that detail, he turned away, gripping the edge of a pew to steady himself. He'd grown up in that church. Elijah had baptized his own daughter. Now, he couldn't comprehend how the man who once preached salvation could commit something so monstrous. They began a statewide manhunt. Roadblocks were set up on every major route out of Ravens Creek. Elijah's photo was broadcast on every news station, his calm, smiling face juxtaposed with the word, "Wanted," in bold red letters. But Elijah Moore had vanished. Detectives searched his office and home for clues. In his study, they found notebooks filled with frantic handwriting, pages of scripture rewritten and twisted. One passage was repeated over and over again in uneven ink. Greater than, the flesh must return to the earth so the spirit may rise in light. In the corner of the room stood a half-finished wooden box, roughly the size of a coffin, with a cross carved into its lid. It reeked of oil and incense. Neighbors began to share their own stories. Some claimed they had seen Elijah wandering near the woods behind the church late at night, muttering prayers. Others said they heard strange chanting echoing from the church basement long after midnight. By the fourth day, search teams were combing through the forest, the swamps, even abandoned wells. Dogs picked up his scent near a shallow creek, but it disappeared as suddenly as it began. It was as if Elijah had been swallowed by the earth itself. That night, as the sheriff prepared to call off the search until morning, one of the deputies burst into the station, his face white as chalk. He held up a crumpled piece of paper they'd found nailed to a tree near the church. Written in the same red ink were the words, "Don't look for me, he has chosen me too." By the time the sun rose over Ravens Creek the next morning, fear had replaced faith. The church's doors were locked and sealed off with yellow tape, but locals still gathered outside, praying, whispering, or simply staring at the place that had become a nightmare. The man they once called Pastor Elijah was now the most wanted fugitive in the county. Sheriff Henson barely slept. The message found in the woods, "Don't look for me. He has chosen me, too," haunted him. Who was he referring to? God, or something darker that Elijah had come to believe was divine. At dawn, search teams headed deeper into the forest behind the church, an area that stretched for miles and was mostly swamp and thick pine. The dogs picked up a faint scent again, leading them to a clearing that looked disturbingly familiar to the sheriff. It was the old Hollow Creek revival grounds, where Elijah had once held week-long prayer retreats years ago. The wooden altar was still there, rotting and covered in moss. Candles were scattered around, some freshly melted. Someone had been there recently. Then they found something buried beneath the altar. A deputy uncovered a wooden chest, old and heavy, bound with a rusty chain. When they pried it open, they didn't find money or documents, just a bundle of handwritten pages and a small recorder. The pages were titled, "The Ascension Doctrine, Revelation to Elijah Moore." As the sheriff skimmed the first few lines, his hands trembled. Greater than, "The Lord came to me in fire and told me my family is impure flesh. To bring them home, I must return them to the ground. When the trumpet sounds, they will rise again beside me." It wasn't scripture, it was madness. Then they pressed play on the recorder. The voice was unmistakable, Elijah's calm, measured tone, the same one that had once filled Sunday sermons. But now it carried something cold, almost hollow. Greater than, "Tonight, I make the offering. They will sleep below until the trumpet calls. The ground beneath his house is holy, and there they will be reborn. I will follow soon, I will not be far behind." For a long moment, no one spoke. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then the deputy shouted, something had moved in the trees. The team spun around, weapons drawn, flashlights cutting through the dense pine shadows. There, at the edge of the clearing, a tall figure in black stood watching them. It was Pastor Elijah. His clothes were dirty, his hands covered in mud, and his eyes empty, as if he'd already left this world behind. Before anyone could react, he whispered, "You shouldn't have come here," and bolted into the woods. The chase began. The night chase through Ravens Creek Forest. The forest erupted into chaos. Sheriff Henson and his team sprinted after Pastor Elijah, their flashlights slicing through the dense pine shadows as branches snapped under their boots. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of decay. Somewhere ahead, the faint sound of heavy breathing and breaking twigs echoed through the dark. "Elijah, stop, you're only making it worse," the sheriff shouted, his voice carrying through the woods. But Elijah didn't stop. He moved fast, too fast for a man who'd supposedly been hiding in the wilderness for days. His dark figure weaved between trees like he knew the forest by heart. The deeper they chased him, the quieter the woods seemed to become. Even the crickets had stopped. Then, without warning, the trail split into two. The dogs barked wildly, confused. A deputy followed a false scent, but Sheriff Henson kept moving straight, guided by the faint glimmer of candlelight in the distance. When he reached the clearing, he froze. There was an old wooden shack, one that hadn't been marked on any property map. Candles burned in a circle around it, flickering like fireflies. Strange symbols were painted on the shack's door in dark, dripping strokes, crosses interlaced with spirals and words that looked like corrupted scripture. Inside, he could hear a low murmuring voice. He signaled his deputies to flank the entrance. On his count, they kicked the door open and stormed inside. The stench hit them first, rotten burnt oil. Then they saw Elijah, kneeling before a crude altar made of stones and wood. His hands were clasped, and he was whispering something over and over. "Greater than, they're awake now, they're calling me." On the altar lay 3 children's dolls, each wrapped in white cloth and tied with rope. Beneath them, the floorboards had been torn open, exposing a deep pit filled with blackened soil. The sheriff's voice cracked. "Elijah, it's over. Get up." The pastor turned slowly, his eyes wide, pupils dilated. "It's never over, Dale. You don't understand. The earth has taken him, and soon it will take me too. We'll be whole again." He reached for something beneath the altar, a small knife carved from bone. Deputies rushed forward, tackling him to the ground. Elijah screamed, a raw, animal sound, as they wrestled the blade from his hand. Even restrained, he laughed, a low, rasping sound that made the deputy's skin crawl. "You can lock me up," he whispered, "but he's already here." That's when one of the deputies shouted in panic. The pit beneath the altar, where the soil had been disturbed, was moving. As if something beneath it was shifting, pushing upward. The room fell silent, every breath caught in terror. And then, a faint voice, soft, almost childlike, rose from the pit and whispered, "Daddy." The voice from the pit. For a few seconds, no one in the shack moved. Every flashlight beam trembled, fixed on that pit of black earth. The air was thick, too thick, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Did anyone else hear that?" One deputy whispered. Sheriff Henson didn't answer. He just nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the pit. He had heard it too. The voice, soft, fragile, unmistakably that of a child, had come from beneath the floor. Elijah's laughter broke the silence. He was still pinned to the ground, but now his face twisted into something unrecognizable, ecstatic, feverish. "See, they live. They've risen just like he promised." He shouted. "You tried to bury faith, but faith can't die. Shut him up." The sheriff barked. 2 deputies held Elijah tighter, but he didn't stop smiling. The sheriff approached the pit carefully, kneeling beside it. His flashlight beam trembled as it revealed movement in the dirt, slow, almost rhythmic. Then, just for an instant, a pale, small hand pushed through the soil, and disappeared again. Henson stumbled backward, heart pounding. "Get the forensics team out here, now," he yelled into his radio. But before anyone could move, all the candles flickered violently. The wind outside howled, rattling the shack's thin walls. And then the whispering began. Not one voice, but 3. They overlapped, rising and falling in eerie harmony, like a chant without language. The sound seemed to crawl along the walls, vibrating in the deputies' chests. One of them dropped his flashlight. "This isn't right, Sheriff. This isn't human," he stammered. But Elijah only laughed harder, tears streaming down his face. "They're close, don't you see? They've crossed over. He's letting me hear them before the world burns." The sheriff snapped. He lunged forward and grabbed Elijah by the collar. "What did you do to them? Tell me." The pastor smiled, peaceful now, almost tender. "I didn't kill them," he whispered. "I freed them." Before anyone could react, the ground beneath Elijah began to shake. Dust rained from the rafters. The earth under the shack buckled and split with a deafening crack. Deputies scrambled out as the floor gave way entirely, swallowing the altar, the candles, and Elijah himself. When the tremor stopped, the pit was gone, sealed again, as if nothing had ever been there. The deputies stood outside, gasping for breath, staring at the collapsed shack. And from deep underground, muffled but clear, came one last whisper. The return to the church. By dawn, the forest around the old shack was swarming with law enforcement and rescue teams. The ground was still unstable, the soil cracked and loose where the structure had collapsed. Despite digging for hours, no one found Elijah's body. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Sheriff Henson stood by the tree line, his face pale and hollow-eyed. "We'll search again when it's safe," he muttered, though deep down, he knew there was nothing to find. The hole had closed itself like a wound. But what haunted him most wasn't Elijah's disappearance, it was that voice. The whisper from beneath the soil. The small, pleading, "Daddy," that none of the deputies wanted to admit they'd heard. That night, Henson drove back to the church. Alone. He shouldn't have. The investigation was still active, and the building had been sealed off, but something inside him needed answers. Maybe guilt, maybe obsession. He parked his cruiser under the flickering streetlight and approached the church doors, flashlight in hand. The moment he stepped inside, the smell hit him again. That same, faint sweetness mixed with decay. The sanctuary was silent, dust particles floating through the beam of his light. The Bible still lay open on the pulpit, pages stiff with dried red stains. Someone, probably Elijah, had underlined one verse in thick ink. Greater than, "For the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible," 1 Corinthians 15:52. Henson exhaled shakily. He walked toward the basement door, now reinforced with police tape. It was foolish to go down there alone, but he couldn't stop himself. He peeled back the tape, unlocked the door, and descended the narrow stairs. The basement was cold, colder than before. The smell stronger. The 3 graves had been exhumed days ago, the bodies removed for autopsy. But something new caught his eye, fresh soil scattered across the concrete floor, as if someone had been digging again. And then, footsteps, soft, dragging, coming from the far corner of the basement. "Hello," the sheriff called out, raising his flashlight. "Who's there?" No answer, just that slow, deliberate movement. He turned the light toward the sound, and froze. There, in the corner, stood 3 figures. Small, pale, unmoving. Their eyes reflected the light like glass. The little girl, Grace, still wearing the same dress she'd been buried in. And beside them, half in shadow, stood a 4th figure. Taller, familiar, Pastor Elijah. "Dale," Elijah said softly, his voice calm, almost tender. "You came back, you heard 'em too, didn't you?" The sheriff stumbled backward, his flashlight trembling. "You're dead," he whispered. Elijah smiled faintly. "No, we're all awake now." Then the lights went out. The lights go out. The darkness fell like a curtain. 1 second the basement was dimly lit by the trembling beam of Sheriff Henson's flashlight, and the next, it was gone. Total blackness. The air turned heavy, pressing against his chest like water. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. And beneath it, faint but clear, came the sound of breathing. "Not 1 person, 4. "Elijah," the sheriff's voice cracked. "Stay where you are," a whisper replied from somewhere in the dark. "Greater than, they don't want me to stay. They want you to see." Henson fumbled for his flashlight, slapping the side of it until the beam flickered back to life for half a second, just long enough for him to glimpse them again. The children stood perfectly still, eyes wide and empty, skin gray as ash. Miriam was behind them, her mouth slightly open as if she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Elijah knelt before them, hands lifted like he was praying. Then the light died again. "God help me," Henson muttered, pulling out his sidearm. His fingers shook so badly he could barely grip it. He tried to climb the stairs, but the first step creaked, then snapped beneath his weight. The sound echoed through the basement like a gunshot. The breathing stopped. Then came the scraping. Something, or several somethings, were moving toward him across the concrete floor, their movements slow and jerky, nails dragging along the ground. The sheriff fired into the dark. Once, twice, the flashes of gunfire lit up the basement like lightning, and in those brief blinks of light, he saw them closing in. Miriam was inches away now. Her eyes weren't hateful, they were empty. She reached for him, her hand pale and cold as marble. Henson stumbled backward, firing again. He turned toward the stairs, only to see Elijah standing halfway up them, smiling through the shadows. "You see now, Dale, the pastor whispered. Death is only the doorway. You're still on the wrong side. The sheriff lunged, slamming his shoulder into Elijah, sending them both tumbling to the floor. The flashlight rolled across the ground and landed facing upward. The dim beam revealed Elijah's face, blood seeping from his nose, his lips still curved in that awful, peaceful smile. Why, Elijah, Henson gasped. Why your own family? Elijah's eyes flicked toward the graves. Because he asked for them first, he whispered. And now, he wants you. Then the walls began to shake. Dust fell from the ceiling. A deep rumbling filled the basement, like something beneath the church was waking up. The sheriff barely had time to grab his flashlight and run up the collapsing stairs. Behind him, the basement floor cracked open once more, a blinding red light pouring from the earth itself. And echoing through the church above, so loud it made the windows shatter, came a single, unearthly sound. A trumpet, the trumpet beneath the earth. The sound was unlike anything Sheriff Henson had ever heard, deep, metallic, and ancient. It wasn't coming from the sky. It was rising from beneath the church. He staggered into the main sanctuary, clutching his flashlight and weapon, heart pounding against his ribs. The floorboards trembled beneath his boots. Dust and splinters rained from the ceiling as that unholy trumpet blared again, long and hollow, shaking every window in the old wooden chapel. Outside, dogs howled. Lights flickered across the empty parking lot. The few deputies on patrol nearby came running, but none dared enter. The sound was too unnatural, too alive. Inside, the sheriff fell to his knees near the pulpit. His flashlight beam swung wildly across the walls, illuminating Bible verses smeared in blood and ash. The church organ, untouched for years, began to play by itself, slow, discordant notes echoing in perfect rhythm with the trumpet's wail. "Make it stop," Henson screamed into the darkness. "What do you want from me?" From somewhere deep below, Elijah's voice answered, faint but unmistakable. "Greater than, you can't stop it, Dale. The ground has already opened. He's claiming what's his." The sheriff aimed his gun at the basement door, now glowing faintly red from the light beneath it. His breath came in ragged gasps. He could hear whispering, dozens of voices overlapping in some language he couldn't understand. Then, the floorboard split. A jagged crack tore through the center aisle, stretching from the pulpit to the church entrance. The wood bowed upward, splintering. Henson stumbled back as a rush of hot air burst from the fissure, carrying the scent of burning oil and rot. And from that crack, something began to rise. At first, it looked like smoke, but it moved with intent, swirling and twisting into shapes that resembled faces, hands, souls. He could see them, Miriam, the children, and behind them, countless others. Their mouths opened in silent screams as the smoke thickened, climbing toward the ceiling like a storm of shadows. The sheriff fired again and again, the sound lost beneath the trumpet's endless blast. Each bullet passed through the shapes without harm. They weren't physical, they were something else. The organ stopped. The trumpet faded. For a brief second, there was silence. Then, in the distance, church bells began to ring. But there was no one left alive to ring them. The sheriff turned and ran, bursting through the church doors into the cold night. When he looked back, flames were licking at the stained glass, but the fire wasn't red, it was black, like smoke burning in reverse. He collapsed beside his cruiser, gasping for air, and watched as the church, Ravens Creek's holiest place, was slowly consumed by darkness from within. And through the roar, he heard a voice whisper one last time, soft, calm, and familiar. "Greater than, don't be afraid, Dale. You'll join us soon." The church gave one final groan as the steeple collapsed, burying itself in the earth. And then, everything was silent.